everybody. It's Mark Bassett with another episode of Supply Chain Matters, where I'm speaking with a wide variety of sustainability experts from all walks of life to learn a little bit from them as we've started our sustainability journey here at Hemlock and my personal journey. I don't consider myself an expert. Joining me today is Bill Weihl, who's the founder and executive director at ClimateVoice. Welcome, Bill. How's everything in San Francisco?
Things are great. It's a beautiful day outside. It's often beautiful here in San Francisco, so not much to complain about.
Well, good. We're here in Midland, Michigan. It's kind of nice out, but it's 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so probably not quite as warm as what you have in San Francisco.
Indeed.
Yeah. So the first thing that we've talked a couple of times, Bill, and I looked at your LinkedIn profile. I think the first thing that I found really interesting is you have a PhD in computer science from MIT. You were an associate professor at MIT, so you had tenure. You then kind of branched out into industry. You were a CTO at a computer-oriented computer scientist company. And then all of a sudden you were the Green Energy Czar, which I love that title, Green Energy Czar at Google. Maybe you could spend a few minutes talking about how you go from being an associate professor of computer science at MIT to the Green Energy Czar at Google.
Sure. Well, it wasn't quite all of a sudden. I mean, I think there definitely was a lot of thinking along the way. I've cared about the environment and been interested in environmental solutions, solar, my whole life. It just wasn't the direction I kind of went into in school and professionally for the first part of my career. But in the early 2000s, I was getting more and more concerned about reading more and more about climate change. And having spent my career in a field that was all about exponential change, Moore's Law, et cetera, and thinking about algorithms and other things where we worry all the time about nonlinear growth and nonlinear effects and so on. I think maybe I was better positioned than many to at least intellectually understand and keep focused on what the climate models were showing us. I was reading about climate change and getting more and more worried. And when I was thinking about leaving Akamai in 2004, what was really animating me and keeping me up at night and so on was climate. Not the work I was doing at Akamai, not what I'd been doing for the previous, honestly, 20 years of my career. So I decided to see if I could do something professionally on climate. And that all of a sudden I was Green Energy Czar. I spent about 14 months on I guess what the Australians would call a walkabout, talking to lots of people and exploring. Given my background, my training in computer science and in science and engineering broadly, the business experience I'd gotten at Akamai over the previous several years as CTO, where could I put my experience and talents and skills to use on climate? And was lucky enough in the end to land the job at Google, where initially I think my title was something like energy strategist, something boring. And at one point, about 6 months later, my boss said to me, "You need a more interesting title. How about Green Energy Czar?" Yeah. So that's where that came from.
So were you the first kind of person kind of leading an organization that thought about that, or that had to have been kind of at the infancy at least?
It was very early. There was one person. I was hired into the data center operations side with the part of the organization that designed and manufactured the servers and built the data centers and ran them, that part of the organization. There was one person on the sort of corporate facilities, offices side who was thinking about environmental issues, sustainability, climate generally. She had been working, when I joined, had already put in place the work to put a, I think, 1.6 megawatt solar array on the Google Mountain View campus, which at the time was, I think, the biggest private, corporate installation of solar, at least in the country, if not the world. It's 1.6 megawatts is still pretty good size for that kind of thing, though it's not quite as remarkable as it was back in 2006, 2007. So I was the first person brought in really with a sole focus on climate and what Google should do about climate. Yeah.
And so you did that for a number of years, and there were some other things, but you then ended up in a similar role at Facebook. I think one of the things I would be interested in hearing about is, obviously two very large, sophisticated, forward-thinking companies, of how they thought about sustainability and climate evolved during those 10 plus years of you playing in that space.
The bar really rose in that time. I mean, when I joined Google, there were a few companies, not really, I think among the technology companies, I mean, certainly tech companies that like Intel and others with big manufacturing operations worried about environmental issues, but it was more of an EH&S compliance, we're using nasty chemicals, let's not do bad things with them and dump them out the back or whatever. Intel, I believe, was buying a lot of clean energy in the form of RECs back in the mid 2000s. Most tech companies were doing little or nothing on clean energy and climate. And there were a few companies in other sectors that were leading on climate, but it was really at its infancy. So there was no clear expectation. It really was a situation of the founders and the top execs at Google wanted to do something about this, and they hired me as a reasonably smart person who understood their technology and their business and some about climate and energy, who they believed could learn a lot more and bring in the appropriate people to help. They hired me to lead the effort to figure out what they could and should do. When I joined Facebook, that was basically right at the time Facebook made a commitment to 100% clean energy, and they were the first major tech company to do that. They did it in part because of pressure from Greenpeace. Greenpeace had run a campaign against them the previous year and a half. And so that was where the bar, because of external pressure, was really starting to rise. Yeah. And I'd say today we're at a state where, certainly for major companies like that, the expectations are pretty high, but I would argue not quite high enough. That there's a pretty high bar for what companies are expected to do in their operations and even in their supply chain. That's beginning to grow, but not enough attention is being paid to the ways in which companies engage more broadly in society, and in the public policy that really drives the rules for the markets that all of these things are part of.
Right. Yeah, I want to jump back to, because you and I have talked a little bit about companies making aspirational goals, which are great, but then are their actions congruent? I want to come back to that. But before we get there, I wanted to kind of, at Hemlock, we're certainly not Google or Facebook. We're a manufacturing company. So much like you indicated with Intel, we've been super focused on EH&S and making sure we don't have chemical releases and impact the community and our employees. We've been really focused on things like raw material efficiency and energy efficiency. So how do we use less of those things? Really, just in transparency from a kind of a business paradigm of, being more efficient with your costs. And we've just really started, I'd say, in the last 18 months, thinking more kind of in a forward-thinking manner of sustainability, from simple things of, we've issued our first sustainability report. We've done some simple things like go to biodegradable materials in our cafeteria, which may not move the needle for a company like ours, but it's a statement of, hey, we're getting serious about this. Yeah. I'd love to get just a few thoughts from your advice, having kind of driven other companies through this journey from kind of an infancy to something more sophisticated. Any kind of advice you might have for us at Hemlock of kind of next steps in our journey?
It really helps to have direction from the top, which I think you guys obviously have. I think that without that, it becomes, a battle among different parts of the company. The things where somebody can do it and it's easy and they can just do it, then it can still happen. But if it requires cooperation, collaboration among different business units or different functions, having real support and a mandate from the top really matters. But I think, the point you made about it's one thing to set goals, 100% clean energy, carbon neutral, carbon negative, improve efficiency of energy or materials by X percent by whatever date. Goals like that are great, and they often sound really good in public, but sometimes companies don't follow through, and sometimes that's because it turns out to be harder than they expected, and that's I personally would rather set think of them as stretch goals, and then maybe fall a little bit short. Right. Then set easy, goals that where I know how to meet them and maybe hit those, but fall well short of where we could have been. So, aim for the stars, maybe you land on the moon. If you aim for the treetops, if you're lucky, you end up sort of halfway up. So, so I think having 20, 30 goals or whatever is important, but having measurable KPIs that you hold people to account for every year is also really, really important. So yeah, you got to line up the internal actions with the general aspirations and external statements.
We have KPIs around energy usage per kilogram of product. We're actually trying this year to come up with a single carbon metric that we track kind of month in, month out. Have you actually seen, out of curiosity, seen anything like that at any of the companies you've been at?
We didn't track, we did really track things monthly, but the targets that we set were, typically annual. There are some things, some of the changes, especially when you started to look at things like what percentage of our energy came from renewables, that tended to go in sort of step changes, right? We sign a new contract and suddenly we've got 100 megawatts of wind or solar coming into a facility. Then, boom, that percentage of renewables just jumped way up. So it tended to be, much more of a stair-step pattern as opposed to, every month we're going to get a 3% improvement. So we really tried to take the long view, not just week to week or month to month, but we had dashboards certainly that track that kind of thing.
Shifting gears a little bit, again, I find it really interesting. Here you are working for two of the biggest companies in the world, major corporation, and now it's really, in a certain sense, while it's still related to sustainability and the environment, frankly, a fundamental kind of change where you're really trying to create a grassroots organization and create change from the bottom up, not the top down. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how you got there and what you're trying to do at ClimateVoice, I guess.
Yeah. So our broad goal is to get companies, especially the bigger influential companies, but it's really all companies, to go all in on climate. Right. And this is a big ask. We recognize that, but climate is an existential crisis. It's unfolding slowly compared to, say, COVID, but it's going to be worse if we don't deal with it. And so we need to step up and address it. And fortunately, we have more time than we did with COVID, so we don't shut the economy down to deal with it, and so on. But that means anything a company does, we would like them to consider not just the financial bottom line, which every company obviously does, or the ones that stay in business certainly do, but also the climate bottom line. And not just the climate bottom line for their operations and sort of their business, but really the climate bottom line for the community that they operate in and that they serve. And that community could be, a city, it could be a county, it could be a state, could be the country or the whole world. Basically everywhere they operate, we want them to be thinking about that in terms of the facilities they build, the energy they produce or purchase, how and where they source their products, what they sell their products to be used for. This has been a big issue with some companies in the last couple of years. Are they selling their products and services to the oil companies? And are they doing that to really help the oil companies make a transition to this zero carbon future we all need to move to? Or are their products being used to help the oil companies basically expand their fossil fuel business? And employees have been rising up at some companies and saying, this is not okay. We can't on the one hand be saying, we care about climate, it's a crisis, we're doing everything we can. On the other hand, be enabling oil and gas to grow their business even faster. Those are inconsistent. Right. So all in means across everything they do, and most especially their engagement with public policy. And some people say we're winning, just not fast enough. Winning too slowly is losing when it comes to climate. So to counter that, we need companies that care about climate to be willing to step up and actually put their influence in play to counter the negative influence of the mostly fossil fuel companies that have been pushing denial and now inaction.
So one last question, Bill, and then we'll let you go. I know you need to get back to your work and your family. As you and I have talked, we adhere to Hemlock along with some of our peer companies have started something called the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance, because it turns out that not all solar panels are created equal, and some are actually built behind 100% dirty coal. Coal is used to produce all of it, whereas others, that's not the case, and they have about half the embodied carbon. And I'd love to get your thoughts around how we can get better awareness, both from policymakers, which is where you're focused on at ClimateVoice, but also with inside companies where internal metrics often don't consider things other than kind of price or cost. Yeah. And your thoughts on how to advance that potentially.
I think green procurement is a really important area for organizations of all sizes, and that's true whether it's for the office furniture you're buying, or the buildings you're leasing or building, or the energy you're buying. When a company signs a power purchase agreement for a bunch of solar or wind, where are those wind turbines and solar panels manufactured? And to your point, what's the embodied carbon? So I think most companies are not looking very deep into their supply chain on those kinds of contracts, and I think that they could and they should. In terms of raising awareness, I think step one, you probably have to come at it from a bunch of different angles. I think one of the places to start would be finding some of the big companies that are signing really big contracts and see if it's something you could convince them to adopt as something they're going to start pushing for. Right. And they might find that it's not something they can do right away, that they can start asking, but they don't, there aren't great options, but it could be something that when they do an RFP, they can say, we want to know the embodied carbon content of the systems you're going to install, and we'll give preference to lower embodied carbon. And we could do the same thing with government procurement, which actually is a huge lever. California has a Buy Clean initiative, which I think right now is about, you and I were talking about this the other day, focuses on high carbon, building materials like cement and steel and so on. Expanding that to cover other things like solar panels, I think would be interesting. And then expanding that to other states and the federal government. I suspect we're going to see a lot of procurement action at the federal level over the next few years. So I think all of those could really move the needle.
Well, thanks a lot, Bill. Really enjoyed the discussion today. Appreciate the time and really admire the work you're trying to do. And as I told you before, if there's anything we can do to help you, let us know. And frankly, on a personal level, I really admire the courage to kind of make some of the huge career transitions you've made. You don't see people making those kind of transitions very frequently. So,
well, thanks Mark. I appreciate it. It's really great, as always, talking with you, and talk to you again sometime soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, Bill.
All right. Thanks. Take care. Bye.